There was a time not so long ago when humankind declared war on the most innocent of creatures, cats. They said felines were servants of the devil, cursed shadows of his will, eyes through which he watched, ears with which he listened, claws with which he stirred unrest. So they burned them, drowned them, cast them into the woods like a sin made flesh. It all began with a single decree, one that fluttered from parchment into wildfire, signed by a man no villager had ever met, Pope Gregory IX. From that moment, fear spread faster than any fire ever could, and as panic swelled across the land, so too did the sickness, a black fog that crept into lungs and homes alike. We would come to know it as the Black Death. But back then, it was simply terror. Even in our quiet valley, tucked far from kings and courts, no one was safe. Not even my cat Pippin. I remember it all. I was there when it began, when the world turned against its smallest protectors. Tonight, I will tell you the whole tale. Our village nestled in a green valley where the hills rolled gently like waves of sleeping giants. No castle loomed above us, no banners fluttered on towers, just the humble rhythm of sun and soil. Life here was slow and sweet, the kind of peace that made you forget there was ever such a thing as trouble. Each morning before the light crested the hills, I slipped from my straw-filled bed and stepped barefoot onto the earth. The air always smelled of dew and sweet corn, rich with the promise of harvest. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant murmurs of waking animals. Near the wooden door of our cottage, Pippin was already waiting, grey as ash, with tired paws and eyes bright from a night's hunt. He stretched with feline pride, claws scraping the stone, before settling near my feet with a low purr. Pippin was more than just a cat to us. He was guardian, mouser, and quiet companion. He kept the rats from our grain and the silence from our hearts. I fetched a bucket of milk and poured a little into a cracked clay bowl. Pippin drank with slow satisfaction, his ears twitching at birdsong. Children scampered past on bare feet, chasing chores and laughter, while their parents called out reminders from garden rows. In the distance, the church bell rang, its voice echoing across the fields, a familiar summons to prayer and peace. I tended the chickens next, scattering grain and humming a tune I barely remembered. Mrs. Greer was already at her oven, white. Flour smudged across her cheek as she kneaded bread with practiced hands. She smiled at me, and the scent of rising dough filled the air like a blessing. By midday, the sun hung high and hot. I paused at the hearth to sip steaming broth and tear off chunks of crusty bread Mrs. Greer had passed my way. Pippin lay sprawled, in a sunbeam, his tail twitching, content as only a cat can be. Outside, laughter drifted in from the barn, where neighbors took their breaks. I watched old Giles scratch his pig behind the ears, while children tossed apples for our shepherd dog, Floss. Later, I joined Jonas, our village blacksmith, on the cottage porch. He was feeding hens and tossing them crumbs with the flair of a court jester. He flicked a piece of honey cinnamon bread at me and grinned. "Eat up, friend, or these hens will start plotting their revenge." His jokes always brightened my day. We leaned back, chewing in silence, watching the light dance on the thatched roofs. The late sun bathed everything in copper gold. Jonas found a feather tangled in his tunic and flung it at me like a dart. "Gotcha, you sky stealer," he said with a chuckle, pretending we were children again. Evening came slow and warm. I knelt by the bean rows in our garden, careful not to trample new shoots. Mrs. Greer, now humming, pulled another golden loaf from her oven. Old man Bart whistled near the hedges, tending his bees. We all had our tasks, our small circles. We were not lords or scholars. We were farmers, laborers, and mothers of soil and sweat. And yet, even as twilight deepened and the sky turned velvet blue, I sensed a change. My grandmother used to say that a black cat crossing your path meant trouble. I always brushed it off, superstition from a time of fear. But that night, Even the frogs chirping by the stone well felt quieter, as if holding their breath. Pippin curled beside the hearth, purring softly. His presence was a comfort, a promise of safety. I believed everything was just as it should be. But beyond the hills, far to the south in a city of stone and echoing marble, change was stirring. In a palace built atop ancient ruins, Pope Gregory IX was writing. We knew of him only through whispers and parchment, his proclamations carried by messengers on dusty roads. To us, he was more myth than man, a distant echo from Rome. Then one morning, the echo became a storm. I was in the churchyard after dawn prayers when Father Michel pulled me aside. His eyes darted like a man who had seen a ghost. He sat on a cold stone bench and leaned in close. "The Pope," he whispered, "says the devil walks in the form of cats." I nearly dropped my hymnal. Around us, the sunlight filtering through stained glass suddenly felt pale and cold. Silence rippled through the churchyard as others caught wind of the words. We stared at each other in disbelief. "The Pope? Cats?" Father Michel's voice was low but firm. "His Holiness believes black cats are the devil's eyes and ears, that witches gather in forests and worship them under the full moon, that they carry the devil's mark." Old Marta beside me clucked her tongue nervously. "Well then," she murmured, "Pippin best start packing." Her joke drew a few nervous chuckles, but no one truly laughed. That afternoon, the village buzzed with whispers. In the market, Jonas shook his head as if trying to rid it of bad thoughts. "He didn't really say that, did he?" he asked me, his voice quiet. I tried to smile, tried to let it pass, but something heavy lingered in the air. In the tavern, a farmer argued with his wife about whether to take the Pope's decree seriously. Another old man leaned in with a grin too wide. "They think every witch's cat has one glowing eye and a twitchy tail." The room tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, like laughter echoing in a tomb. As dusk fell, the mood darkened further. Jonas and I walked to the well together. He dropped the bucket with a thud and stared down into the deep, dark water. "Imagine Pippin, a vessel of evil," he muttered. I looked at Pippin, asleep in the golden light, tail twitching in dreams. I laughed, though the sound felt wrong. "Can't scare him with a sermon," I said, nudging Jonas, but in truth the seed of fear had taken root. Clouds rolled in, casting a strange orange light across the village. The oak tree near the well cast long shadows that seemed to slither more than stretch. Even the children's laughter by the stream felt thinner, uncertain. And as night fell, the wind carried a chill that rattled the shutters and stirred unease in our bones. The next morning, the chapel filled early. Everyone expected the usual Sunday Mass. Instead, Father Michel stood at the altar holding a parchment, sealed in red wax. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled it and began to read aloud. "By order of Pope Gregory IX, and by the grace of Almighty God, cats, especially those of black fur, are declared instruments of the devil. All faithful Christians are henceforth commanded to remove these beasts from our midst." The silence afterward was not peaceful. It was the hush of dread, of hearts holding breath. Mothers clutched kittens to their chests. Children stared at the floor. Jonas, standing beside me, said nothing. Even Father Michel seemed hesitant. "We must trust the Holy Church," he said, though his voice cracked halfway through. Outside, the chickens pecked calmly at the earth, ignorant of the doom just declared. But to us, it sounded like the ticking of a funeral bell. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder. "If the Pope himself says it, what choice do we have?" she whispered. I opened my mouth to argue, but my grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. "Never argue with a priest when your boots are still muddy." And so began the unraveling. It felt as though a fragment of the world's light had flickered out. That night I found Jonas the blacksmith sitting alone, by the dying embers of his hearth, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, as if the fire had stolen all warmth from his soul. He didn't turn when I entered. His hands were clenched around, a piece of firewood unmoving, and his lips parted just enough to whisper, "I buried her behind the barn." I knew without asking who he meant. His cat, soft-furred and always sunbathing atop the forge, gone now by his own hand. "I whispered the whole time," he said, his voice cracking. "She trusted me. I had no choice." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, but it felt more like a gesture for myself than for him. What comfort could possibly survive this madness? We both sat in silence, staring into the embers, as if trying to summon back a better world, one where innocence hadn't been smothered under fear. The fire popped, and in the distance bats skimmed low across the rooftops, their wings whispering through chimney smoke, like soft, cruel reminders that the night belonged to the dark now. By morning, life resumed, or pretended to, but everything had changed. Mrs. Greer stood frozen at the edge of her kitchen, afraid to open the pantry in case her kittens had somehow returned and were waiting behind the flour sacks. Old Marta, once skeptical of saints, now carried a tiny wooden cross, with her everywhere, pressing it to her lips whenever she passed the empty bowl where her tomcat used to dine. A pair of village boys admitted red-faced that they'd hidden a litter of kittens in the barley field, sneaking out each night to feed them morsels of bread. But Jonas only shook his head when he heard. "No more hiding," he said. Quiet, but firm. "We've seen enough darkness this week." The words weren't for the boys. They were for himself. That evening, I found him kneeling beside the old apple press, murmuring the rosary we used to say for good weather and full harvests. I didn't speak. He glanced up and with a tremor in his voice whispered, "Forgive us, Pippin." The name of his cat had become part of a prayer, and in that moment I understood something chilling. We had opened a door we could not close. The Pope may have declared cats unholy, but the true evil had crept not from the beasts, but from within us. Soon, anything strange became a sign of sorcery. When Mrs. Greer's oven erupted in flame, villagers gasped. Was it the devil teasing her dough? When a honey jar crashed to the floor, tooth marks on the wax led one man to mutter about demons nibbling in the night. Even calm evenings saw lamps flicker, and people crossed themselves with shaking hands. No creak or whisper was safe anymore. A strange smell, witchcraft, a cold wind through the shutters, spirits. Marta began drawing chalk crosses over every doorway. Jonas hung rosemary bunches over every threshold, muttering old hedge blessings even he barely remembered. In Mrs. Greer's kitchen, a circle of women clutched each other's hands and chanted prayers their grandmothers had taught them, half remembered, half invented, but sincere. A child, trembling, claimed he'd seen a shadow shaped like a cat dart across the barn wall at midnight. By dawn, he refused to go outside. And in church, Father Michel lit 2 candles for every prayer now, as if he too feared what the dark might bring. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn to names. Mistress Drimple, the quiet widow at the village's edge, was the first to draw suspicion. They said she once had a black cat, long gone now, and that she muttered to herself when walking past the well. A ewe gave birth to 1 lamb instead of 4, and villagers nodded grimly. It was a sign. Fear thickened the air like damp smoke. Garlic garlands hung from barn doors, salt bowls lined hearthstones. People crossed themselves at every sneeze. I tried to stay rational. I remembered Pippin curled in the hay, purring into sleep, but others clung to every shiver and shadow. Jonas caught his coat on a thorn and swore a phantom had clawed him. Mrs. Greer claimed her apron knot untied itself. "The devil," she hissed, "undoes what is tidy." At night, Some villagers crept into the fields, hoping to spot a ghostly green glow or hear a spectral purr on the wind. We became prisoners of our own superstition, held captive by the dread of things we'd never feared before. And then came the rats. Not a few, not even dozens. A tide, a seething, scuttling flood. I saw them first, just before sunrise, darting across the kitchen floor, eyes glowing like embers. By midday, the scent of rat droppings filled the air. Corn was chewed to the cob overnight, wheat husks shredded. One morning, I found an entire grain sack gnawed through, the contents reduced to a dusty spill of nothing. Mrs. Greer screamed when one dashed across her counter, knocking over her biscuits. Old Bart set traps with grim determination, muttering curses with each snap, yet caught nothing but his own thumb. The rats danced between our boots and vanished into the walls, as if they'd been summoned by some curse. Even Pippin, old and frail, sat watching them with twitching ears, pawing at shadows he could no longer chase. It was then we understood, with the clarity of tragedy, what we had done. The cats had been our silent guardians. Without them, the vermin marched unchecked. The women warned their husbands to lock the grain, and barns were sealed even in broad daylight. But it made no difference. Storehouses became nests, cupboards turned to burrows. I watched a rat stare me down from atop a sack of barley as if daring me to act. I felt something in me snap. We'd murdered our protectors, and now we were the prey. At night, the gnawing didn't stop. I heard it beneath the floorboards, 1,000 tiny teeth working away at roots and beams and hopes. Jonas tried fire, lit a bonfire in the southern field to smoke them out. But by morning, the rats had simply moved to the next hollow. "We've traded one devil for another," I muttered, staring into the ash. Desperation made us foolish. We set traps of every kind. Jonas built snares from broomsticks and wire. I tried shooting arrows into the shadows. The shafts struck nothing but walls. Boys carved crude cat masks to scare the vermin, but only the hens were startled. Mrs. Greer left out bowls of milk on her doorstep, hoping God or mercy or magic might answer. That night, Jonas and I even crawled beneath the chapel floor with candles, grabbing at furry tails in the dark. We caught nothing but dust and splinters. By week's end, we were hollowed by fatigue. We built crude barricades of planks around the larders and soaked straw to lure them away. But the rats chewed through the wood and vanished with the bait. Jonas cursed and kicked the earth. "We've lost," he said bitterly. That night we dined in silence. A rat had fallen into the soup pot. Jonas fished it out with long kitchen tongs and flung it into the fire, where it hissed like a dying curse. I forced down bread with trembling hands, wondering what else I had already swallowed. Father Michel wandered through the village that day, seeing our faces, drawn, pale, hollow. He paused before the chapel and lit an extra candle, not for prayer, but perhaps to keep the shadows away. "We must remain strong," he said, his voice tight with emotion. I saw the gleam of tears in his eyes. The old cat's bed in the barn lay empty. The rats had won their kingdom. No cross, no fire, no holy water could dislodge them, and as the first cold winds of autumn crept through the rafters, the village felt spellbound, enchanted not by magic, but by fear, regret, and the relentless sound of tiny feet. It was the only return we would know for now, the beginning of a healing we hadn't dared to ask for. Then, one cold morning, a child's cry pierced the hush of winter. Little Albie, the boy who hadn't raised his voice since the burnings, came barreling down the frost-covered lane, wide-eyed and breathless. "A cat!" he shouted, tears streaking his cheeks. "I saw a cat." At first we thought it was a ghost, a fragment of a dream or some tender hallucination summoned from a boy's aching hope. But then came another, a scraggly shadow near the barns. Ribs showing, ears notched by frost or fights, eyes still full of secrets. Then another and another. They weren't the same cats we'd once known, but they had that same ancient stillness, the same unhurried grace, the same gaze that seemed to weigh your soul and forgive it. Perhaps they were survivors from other villages, or the hidden offspring of those who had fled or somehow been spared. No one could say for sure, but they came back to us slowly, as twilight returns to a valley once lost in shadow. One by one they curled beside hearths and altar steps, wary, but willing, and we dared not question it. Jonas wept when one nestled beside his forge. Mrs. Greer, ever practical, set out a bowl of milk and called it soup. Even Father Michel, stiff with guilt and prayer, set a cushion near the altar and mumbled, "Even saints had pets." And so we sat, that strange healing winter, not in sermons, but in stories. Marta, old and half-blind, recalled her kitten, who batted her spectacles clean off her nose. Jonas told of his tabby, who tried to paw the bellows like it wanted to learn smithing. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, it was soft, like a sigh that remembered joy. It didn't erase the pain, but it softened the sharpest edges. Children dared to name again, Patch, Sprig, Lucky. And oddly, the fields grew quieter. Fewer rats in the granary, the bread rose better, the milk tasted sweeter. Maybe it was the cats. Maybe it was something older, deeper. The lifting of some weight from our chests. The guilt no longer gnawed, it purred. And so we built little shrines at the field's edge, not to ward off evil, but to remember. We left bowls of milk beside them. We laid down our guilt next to our forgiveness and let both sleep. And when strangers passed through the valley and asked about the carved cats watching from every doorstep, we told them the truth. That once we mistook warmth for danger, that once we chose fear over fur, but that now we remember to kneel not only in prayer, but also to scratch behind a whiskered ear. But that, dear dreamer, is only one kind of kingdom. Let me tell you about another. A realm not of hushed snowfall and healing fires, but of cold stone and louder appetites. A land ruled not by guilt, but by vanity, power, and an ever-turning wheel of favor and fear. You've woken now in Tudor England, and I'm afraid you're not a noble, not even close. No, you're a humble servant at Hampton Court Palace, caught in the swirling chaos of King Henry VIII's royal household. And the first thing to hit you, before the politics, before the danger, is the smell. It clings to the stone walls and rush-strewn floors like smoke to a winter coat, a potent blend of sweat, damp straw, cooked meat, unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable tang of human waste. Chamber pots overflow, hallways sometimes serve as lavatories. And though sweet herbs are scattered underfoot in a losing battle, the stench is a part of daily life. You rise from your flea-riddled straw mattress, scratching at fresh bites and pulling on the same rough clothes you wore yesterday and the day before. A chapel bell tolls in the distance, muffled by thick walls and the murmuring shuffle of servants already awake. In the kitchens, the clang of pots announces the start of another royal feast. The year is 1535, and King Henry VIII sits heavily on England's throne, both in power and in girth. The palace is a hive of activity. Hundreds of courtiers, cooks, maids, guards, and hangers-on buzz beneath the same roof. It's crowded, chaotic, and filled with more intrigue than you could imagine. You push past other servants in a corridor, dimly lit by shuttered windows, ducking under a tapestry you know better than to touch. The king has forbidden people from wiping their greasy hands on them, a rule clearly born of experience. Oddly enough, despite the filth, Henry is obsessed with cleanliness, at least in theory. He lines his bed with furs to keep out lice, bans, naked kitchen staff from preparing royal banquets, and insists on designated urination-free zones, marked by red-painted walls. These, of course, have become targets for drunken noblemen, who take the royal decree as more of a challenge than a law. You pass the kitchens, where the scent of roasting bacon cuts briefly through the miasma. It's almost enough to distract. You from the rats, enormous things, bold as lords, picking over scraps of past feasts. Once you saw one drag half a pig's head into a pile of rushes beneath the minstrel's gallery. Your task today is particularly grim. The king's private garderobe, his personal toilet, needs emptying. You approach it with the resigned dread of someone who's done this before, a padded wooden seat over a chute that drops waste into a cesspit below. Royal dignity atop a mountain of filth. The ammonia burns your nostrils, but you hold your breath and get to work. And here, amid the gold leaf and festering rushes, you understand what Tudor life truly is. It's a place where grandeur and grime exist in equal measure, where kings feast on swan while their servants dodge chamber pot spills, where one misplaced word can cost your head. But for now, you grip your sloshing bucket, steady your steps, and keep your eyes down. Welcome to the court of King Henry VIII, where every day might be your last, or perhaps it's just the primal instinct of survival. But even in the filth and frenzy, you and your fellow servants have found an odd pride, almost joy, in keeping this grand and grotesque court spinning. The Tudor palace is a beast, half glorious and half grimy, and every day you feed it. Whether you're buffing the king's gleaming armor till your arms ache, or scrubbing wine stains out of rush-covered floors after a feast, you take your orders with quiet resolve. One day, you're hanging black drapes for yet another royal funeral, and the next, you're mopping blood from the cobblestones where justice, or something pretending to be justice, was done. There's no such thing as routine here. The moment you feel safe in habit is the moment you're most at risk. Then come the trumpets. Their sharp metallic song pierces through the air, and without needing to be told, you snap to attention. The king is coming. In an instant, the corridor's lazy hum turns into a hive of motion. Backs straighten, heads bow, breaths are held. You flatten yourself against the wall, careful not to look too idle or too eager. In the Tudor court, to stand out is to invite danger. You learn early that the nail that sticks out isn't just hammered, it's beheaded. And so begins the whirlwind of history you are about to live through, not from the gilded throne or council chamber, but from the drafty servants' halls and the margins of power, where you will witness one of the most chaotic and bloody reigns in England's long story. Because this is no ordinary monarch. This is Henry VIII, a king driven by a hunger for legacy, a desperation for a son, and a wrathful certainty that God himself backs his will. He will reshape his kingdom, bend the church to his purpose, and leave a trail of discarded wives and broken allies in his wake. And you, dear soul, will see it all, the triumphs and tantrums, the dances and decapitations. The Tudor court is a dazzling, dangerous circus, and you're in the front row, just close enough to feel the fire. So take a breath, adjust your scratchy woolen cap, dab the sweat from your brow, but not with the king's tapestry, unless you fancy a flogging. Life under Henry VIII is a test of cunning and endurance. You'll need both. In the years to come, you will watch queens rise like the dawn and fall like axed trees. You'll see noblemen flattered one day and dragged to the block the next. And through it all, you'll do what servants do, clean up the messes left by people who never even see you, both literal and political. But before the carnage, before the broken marriages and shattered alliances, there was light. You haven't always served a sour, bloated king with oozing leg ulcers and a foul temper. Once upon a time, Henry was young, and so were you. You remember those early years with startling clarity, like a warm dream you can no longer return to. It was 1509. The old king, Henry VII, finally gave up the ghost after years of clutching the throne and the treasury with miserly fingers. And into the sun stepped his 17-year-old son, tall, radiant, with auburn hair like firelight and a voice that could charm birds from trees. This Henry, your Henry, wasn't a tyrant, not yet. He was poetry and pageantry in motion. The kingdom sighed in relief. Where Henry VII had been dour and distrustful, this new king radiated generosity. The royal coffers were bursting thanks to his father's stingy rule, and Henry VIII was ready to spend. He threw out the old regime, literally. Empson and Dudley, the tax collectors everyone loathed, were arrested, locked in the Tower, and publicly executed before the year was out. It was a political masterstroke. Nothing says fresh start like a couple of heads on spikes. And then came the wedding. Weeks after his coronation, the young king married Catherine of Aragon, not some minor princess, but the daughter of none other than Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the same monarchs who sent Columbus across the sea. Catherine was no stranger to England. She'd been betrothed to Henry's elder brother Arthur before he died young. Marrying your dead brother's widow required special permission from the Pope, but young Henry had the favor of Rome. He was a golden prince in the eyes of Christendom, the very image of a Renaissance monarch. The wedding was a spectacle of joy. You remember the bells, the feasts, the gilded processions, and the pair of them, Henry and Catherine, looked like something out of a legend. She was dignified and kind, and he was strong and full of laughter. He threw tournaments with wild abandon. He hunted, danced, played music, wrote poems, pastime. With good company, that catchy tune everyone hummed in the corridors. He wrote that. Sometimes you caught him singing with the chapel choir, his rich tenor voice rising above the rest. Catherine wasn't just a pretty decoration on his arm. In 1513, when Henry gallivanted off to France to play soldier, he left her in charge. As Queen Regent, she ruled with surprising steel. That very summer, the Scots, sensing opportunity, invaded. But Catherine rallied the English forces and crushed the enemy at Flodden Field. She even sent Henry a piece of the Scottish king's bloodied coat as a trophy, along with a cheeky letter. You still chuckle remembering that. The people adored her. You often saw her among the poor, offering coins or comfort. Her devotion was legendary. Every morning her prayers filled the palace chapel like incense. She was, quite literally, a saint in the eyes of many. And yet, behind all the feasting and music, a shadow crept. The royal nursery stayed heartbreakingly quiet. Catherine suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. Infants were born and buried before they learned to crawl. One brief, shining moment came in 1511 when she gave birth to a son. Bells rang, wine flowed, and the whole court celebrated. But the child, named Henry, died just 52 days later. The joy turned to grief so quickly it left everyone reeling. Still they hoped, they prayed. And in February 1516, their hope finally seemed to take root. Catherine gave birth to a healthy child, a daughter. Her name was Mary. By 1526, the whispers of court have turned into unmistakable signs. King Henry is smitten, utterly and embarrassingly besotted with Anne Boleyn. This is not some passing infatuation or a typical royal flirtation. No, this is deeper. You see it in the way he watches her, the way his voice softens when she enters the room, the way he, a man famously averse to writing, has taken up his quill, like a lovesick poet. His letters to Anne are nothing short of passionate declarations. In one, he sighs, "I would you were in my arms, or I in yours, for I think it long since I kissed you." The King of England, warrior, hunter, self-proclaimed, Renaissance man, reduced to a boy aching for affection. It's both astonishing and dangerous. You've seen him invent excuses to drop by Queen Catherine's rooms, not for the Queen, but to steal glimpses of Anne. At feasts and court dances, he arranges for her to be seated nearby, offering her invitations, before the ink on the guest list has dried. Their eyes meet across the ballroom, bold, blazing, and forbidden. Any servant caught looking at a woman like that would be dismissed, flogged, or worse. But this is the king, and who among you dares tell a king no? And yet Anne Boleyn does exactly that. She is unlike any woman at court. Not only does she resist Henry's advances, she refuses to become his mistress, a role her own sister Mary Boleyn once filled before being cast aside like yesterday's pearls. Anne has seen what happens to the king's playthings. She will not be one of them. She's clever, calculating, and determined. If the king wants her, it will cost him everything. Thus begins the most dangerous courtship in English history. A game of seduction and power, where Anne plays her hand with icy precision and the king finds himself hopelessly enthralled. It is like watching a lion chase a bird, wild and hungry, but never quite able to catch it. Anne keeps herself just out of reach, and in doing so, drives Henry nearly mad with longing. And in that madness, a thought begins to take root in the king's mind, one that will change the fate of England forever. He starts to question his marriage to Queen Catherine, not just emotionally, but theologically. Was it truly valid in the eyes of God? After all, she had once been married to his older brother, Prince Arthur. Henry remembers a verse from Leviticus warning that if a man marries his brother's wife, he will be childless. And look, here he is, without a legitimate son. Maybe this is not misfortune. Maybe this is divine punishment. Maybe his marriage is cursed. It is a convenient revelation, yes, but one Henry comes to believe with fervent conviction. If their union is invalid, if it was never true in God's eyes, then he is free to end it. And if he ends it, he is free to marry Anne. And if he marries Anne, surely, God will bless their union with a son, a male heir, salvation for the Tudor dynasty. Thus begins what would come to be known, both in whispers and official papers, as the king's great matter. But this is not just a domestic dispute. Catherine of Aragon is no ordinary queen. She is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, aunt to the mighty Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. To cast her aside is not just a personal rejection, it is a political earthquake. Henry knows this, but he moves forward anyway, confident that his closest advisor, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, can navigate the storm. Wolsey, the grand, rotund cardinal, in crimson robes, has long been the king's fixer, his architect of power, his manager of church and state alike. If anyone can persuade the Pope to grant an annulment, it is Wolsey. In 1527, Henry formally appeals to Pope Clement VII, citing scripture, conscience, and the absence of a male heir. He claims that the sin has finally caught up with him, though, curiously, this conscience only stirs after 18 years of marriage and after Anne Boleyn arrived at court. Still, Wolsey sets about the complex task of securing papal permission. A divorce from Catherine would require Rome's blessing, and Rome, at this time, is in ruins, quite literally. Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, has just sacked the city and holds Pope Clement effectively prisoner. The Vatican is paralyzed. Every request from Henry must pass through the iron grip of a man who views this annulment as an attack on his family's honor. Catherine, for her part, is no silent victim. When she learns of Henry's intent, she does not weep, not publicly. She steels herself. The queen becomes a symbol of sorrow and dignity. Once, you witness her crossing paths with Anne in a narrow corridor. The moment is frozen in time. Catherine's, face pale and cold as marble, Anne's chin raised defiantly, both women radiating fire. They do not speak. They do not need to. Catherine insists her marriage is legitimate. She swears before God and man that her first husband, Prince Arthur, was never her husband in truth, that their union was never consummated. Therefore, the special dispensation the Pope granted allowing her to marry Henry stands firm. She is Henry's true wife and she will not be moved. The court divides. On one side, Team Catherine, traditionalists, clergy and commoners who see her as the true queen, faithful and long-suffering. On the other, Team Anne, reformers, ambitious nobles, and those dazzled by her wit and charm, or eager to ride the wave of change. Even among the servants, battle lines are drawn. In the kitchens, the laundry women whisper prayers for Catherine. In the privy chamber, the king's attendants gamble on when the new queen will take her place. 6 years pass. 6 long, tense years in which England teeters on the brink of scandal, religious upheaval, and civil discord. The Pope delays. Charles pressures. Wolsey wavers. Finally, in 1529, a court is convened at Blackfriars with papal legates presiding. You sneak into the back of the great hall, barely daring to breathe, and then it happens. Queen Catherine rises and walks before her husband, before the entire court, and kneels. The hall falls silent. "Sir," she says, her voice quivering, yet unshakable, "I beseech you, for all the love that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice. Take pity on me. I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife these 20 years or more." Her words strike like thunder. She reminds Henry, and everyone present, that she bore him children, suffered losses, and remained faithful. She challenges him to name any fault she has committed. And when she finishes, she stands, refuses to recognize the court's authority over her marriage, and walks out, ignoring the calls for her return. A queen, proud to the last. Anne is not there, but she does not need to be. The tide is turning. Catherine's display may have won hearts, but it cannot stop what's coming. Wolsey, having failed to deliver the annulment, is dismissed in disgrace. You watch him leave Hampton Court, his own palace, stripped of power, dignity, and the king's favor. On his journey south, likely toward trial and execution, Wolsey falls ill and dies in November 1530. His final words are whispered with bitter regret. "Had I but served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." With Wolsey gone, Anne tightens her grip on the court. Her allies rise. Chief among them, a brilliant and ruthless commoner named Thomas Cromwell and a reformist cleric, Thomas Cranmer. Both will become key architects of a revolution. By late 1532, Anne's message is clear. She will not sleep with the king until she is queen, and Henry, nearly 42 and desperate for a son, has had enough. If the Pope won't grant his annulment, then England will stop asking Rome altogether. The break begins. In early 1533, Henry appoints Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer quickly declares Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, not in Rome, but in England. Just like that, the English Church begins to drift from the Vatican's control. Around this time, Anne and Henry marry in secret. Anne is already pregnant. The formal wedding and her splendid coronation comes soon after. In a matter of months, Catherine is stripped of her title, banished to damp castles far from court, and forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary. She refuses to yield, refuses to call herself anything but queen, even as you decorate Westminster with Anne's falcon crest and the motto, "The Most Happy." You hear whispers of Catherine, alone and unbowed. She dies in January 1536, still calling herself Queen of England. Her final letters are signed, Catherine the Queen. When word reaches court, Henry and Anne reportedly dress in bright yellow. Some say it's a celebration, others claim it's mourning in the Spanish custom. Either way, the symbolism is unmistakable. Catherine is gone. Anne has triumphed. You, a servant among shadows, have witnessed history, a queen dethroned, a kingdom torn, and yet something tells you the storm has only just begun. Henry has his bride, but will he get his long-awaited son? Or has Anne Boleyn climbed to the highest tower only to find it shaking beneath her feet? The wheel of fortune turns, and it turns swiftly. Take a deep breath, because the next chapter in this royal drama is not for the faint of heart. The tides have shifted, and the glittering ascent of Anne Boleyn has begun to darken with foreboding clouds. It is the summer of 1533, and Anne Boleyn now wears the crown. The court she presides over bears little resemblance to the one shaped by Queen Catherine's devout influence. Gone are the austere ceremonies and humble piety. In their place blooms a court filled with French fashion, flirtation, and a flamboyant spirit that mirrors Anne herself. You recall the grandeur of her coronation, how she glided through London in a golden carriage, cloaked in white and gold, her dark hair glistening beneath a bejeweled crown. Crowds filled the streets, some cheering, others murmuring "Nan Bullen" with contempt. Yet outwardly the spectacle was dazzling. Anne had chosen her motto, "The most happy," and for that moment she seemed to embody it. Then came the birth. The court buzzed with anticipation. Astrologers, terrified of being wrong, predicted a boy. Jousts were planned, bonfires prepared. You remember the silence that fell when the news broke. A girl, a healthy, radiant child, named Elizabeth in honor of the king's mother, but not the heir Henry had prayed for. Publicly, the king was gracious. There was a lavish christening. But behind closed doors, whispers began. The jousts were cancelled, the smiles forced. "Anne is young," Henry insisted. "There will be sons yet." And so life resumed under the reign of this sharp-tongued, quick-witted queen who dared to challenge Henry in ways Catherine never would. Anne was no docile consort. She sparred with Henry, sometimes loudly enough that courtiers joked about the thunderclaps of the Tudors. Yet their passion was undeniable. Fights that erupted into fury just as quickly dissolved into fervent reconciliations. You often found yourself rushing from room to room, fetching wine for their romantic reunions, or clearing the hallway after a royal tantrum. But beneath this volatile love story, a deeper revolution stirred. With the 1534 Act of Supremacy, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. The kingdom's religious foundation cracked. Under the guidance of Cromwell, monasteries across England were shuttered. You saw wagons loaded with gilded chalices, embroidered vestments, and church bells rolled into the treasury. The displaced monks and nuns vanished into uncertain futures. While Henry and Anne revelled in this windfall, peasants muttered of curses and divine punishment. Many feared the realm itself was under judgment. Anne, an advocate for reform, fueled the fire. She gifted the king with Protestant writings and encouraged the spread of English Bibles. To some, she was a beacon of progress. To others, the very face of blasphemy. You heard both views in whispers through the halls, one day helping set up a sermon by a reformist preacher Anne favoured, the next listening to hushed voices blame the queen for plagues and failing harvests. Her image divided the nation, but at court she remained a radiant figure, presiding over masques and banquets like a duchess of old France. Clad in daring fashion and her signature pearl bee necklace, she was dazzling, unpredictable, magnetic. And yet the shadows grew longer. Anne knew her crown rested upon the fragile hope of delivering a son. In 1534, she was again rumored to be pregnant, but the hope was short-lived. A miscarriage or false pregnancy, hushed and painful. You noticed her temper, flaring more frequently. She snapped at servants for trivial faults. Meanwhile, Henry began to drift, his gaze settling on a new figure, Jane Seymour. Jane was everything. Anne was not. Quiet, reserved, and demure. Where Anne had enthralled Henry with bold wit, Jane held his attention with soft-spoken obedience. Dangerous echoes of Henry's sainted mother haunted the comparison. Then came a chilling sign of what defiance might cost. In 1535, Sir Thomas More, once the king's close friend, was executed for refusing to acknowledge Anne as queen or Henry's break from Rome. You remember packing More's confiscated books, a somber task that drove home a terrifying truth. No one was safe when loyalty to the king faltered. By the start of 1536, Anne's world trembled. On January 7th, Queen Catherine died. Anne and Henry, dressed in bright yellow, called it a sign of freedom. But the joy curdled quickly. Later that month, Anne miscarried again, this time a male child, reportedly around 15 weeks along. Some said it occurred the same day as Catherine's funeral. Others pointed to Henry's near-fatal jousting accident shortly before. Regardless, the loss was devastating. Henry, who had already begun to doubt, now seemed certain. Anne could not give him sons. "God will not give me male children by her," he reportedly said. The king's affections turned more openly to Jane Seymour. Anne, once the center of his world, found herself increasingly isolated. Her jealousy only fueled his disdain. Where once he had adored her fire, he now found it exhausting. Jane, modest and gentle, became a living rebuke of everything Anne represented. And so the king began to prepare for another exit. But this time there would be no lengthy annulment, no diplomatic wrangling. Anne was not Catherine. She had no powerful foreign relatives, no popular support. The allies who once lifted her to the throne now backed away, calculating their own survival. Then came Thomas Cromwell, the king's ever-calculating minister. Once Anne's ally in the religious reforms, he now viewed her as a liability. Whether motivated by personal revenge or a quiet nod from Henry, Cromwell orchestrated a staggering campaign. In May 1536, Queen Anne was arrested. The charges were monstrous: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, and conspiracy to kill the king. As you watched her being led to the barge that would carry her to the Tower of London, her back straight and head high, despite the humiliation, you felt a chill that never quite left you. Some of the accused men were close to the king: Henry, Norris, the groom of the stool, the courtier Francis Weston, the musician Mark Smeaton, and Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. Rumors ran rampant. Some said Smeaton confessed under torture, but anyone who had served at court knew how little truth mattered when the king had made up his mind. What unfolded next was a tragedy that made it clear: in Henry's England, love could turn to loathing and favor to fatality in the blink of an eye. And this was only the beginning of the end. The first 3 wives of Henry VIII have already left their mark. One divorced, one beheaded, and now a third is poised to tread a perilous path. The mood at court has shifted dramatically. After the brutal dispatch of Anne Boleyn, her supposed lovers executed with savage efficiency, one by hanging and quartering, another, George Boleyn, beheaded only after suffering through a sermon. Condemning him for sins of incest, attention turned swiftly to Anne herself. The great machinery of Tudor justice moved without pause. On that very day, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Anne null and void, stripping their daughter, Elizabeth, of legitimacy, reducing her from royal heir to bastard. It was as if Anne had never been queen at all, and then came the final, mercifully quick chapter of her story. Perhaps wary of the public gore that marked Catherine Howard's later execution, and mindful of Anne's quick wit even in moments of despair, Henry ordered a swordsman from France to carry out her sentence swiftly, cleanly. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, now stripped of all titles and finery, walked with measured grace to the scaffold on Tower Green. You managed to slip into the crowd of courtiers and guards, no more than 200 witnesses, their breaths held in collective anticipation. Anne's gown is simple grey, her hair covered by a white coif. She looks smaller now, more delicate, but her composure is remarkable. She does not beg. She does not admit guilt. Instead, she speaks of the king's mercy, asking only that the crowd pray for him, for a kinder prince, she says, was never born. She kneels upright, blindfolded, while her sobbing ladies remove her headdress and step back. The executioner, trained in the art of swift death, moves silently, barefoot on the scaffold. In a final piece of theatrical misdirection, he calls out for the sword. "Bring me the sword!" prompting Anne to turn her head instinctively. In that instant, steel whistles through the air. One clean stroke. It is done. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Some cry out. You feel your stomach twist but cannot look away. Anne's ladies tenderly gather her remains, wrapping her head in a cloth and placing her body in a crude arrow chest. There was no coffin prepared. The woman for whom a kingdom was overturned now lies cold in an old storage box, as if history has already moved on. Henry did not attend. In fact, we later hear he was out hunting that morning, eager for the signal. The thunder of cannon from the tower. That sound told him Anne was dead, and in that same breath he galloped to Jane Seymour's side, betrothing himself before Anne's blood had cooled. By the next day, he was celebrating. That is the nature of Henry's court, ruthless, fast-moving, and utterly unmoored from sentiment. We, the servants, were ordered to sweep out Anne's apartments at once. Her initials, her falcon badge, her personal possessions cleared away with terrifying speed, as if she had never existed. Some of Anne's ladies weep softly, others whisper that justice has been served. But all of us know this now, without question. Henry VIII will not hesitate to remove a wife who stands in his way. 2 queens down, 4 more to come. Though few can imagine such a number just yet, as you finish cleaning the last of her chambers, your eye catches on something she left behind, an unfinished piece of embroidery, a Tudor rose, barely complete. You shudder, a ghost of a queen. Now, and her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, is no longer royal in name, just another child of a discarded woman. And yet Henry is already moving on. He believes he can still secure his legacy, that the next wife will give him what the others could not. A son, a prince. And so, in a blur of days, England prepares for another royal wedding. Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, is installed before the month is out. Her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," is embroidered across her canopy, a quiet promise of compliance after the tempestuous queens before her. In contrast to Anne's wit and fire, Jane is calm, pale, and gentle. She does not flirt, she does not challenge. Her quiet presence soothes Henry's bruised ego and weary court. The change is immediate. Gone are the daring French fashions and music. In their place, modest gowns, pious readings, and embroidery circles. Some courtiers mutter that she is dull. Others, especially Catherine of Aragon's old supporters, breathe easier. Jane seems to embody a return to virtue, and remarkably, she sets about healing royal wounds. With patient determination, she convinces Henry to reconcile with his estranged daughter Mary. It takes much pleading, and Mary is forced to sign a humiliating document accepting her father's authority and denouncing her mother's marriage. But in July 1536, she returns to court. One day, you see Mary walking beside Jane in the gardens, eyes red with tears but shining with hope. Jane, ever kind, even tries to extend affection toward little Elizabeth, though Henry shows little interest. Still, Jane's efforts to reunite the fractured royal family do not go unnoticed. For now, she is praised as a peacemaker, a quiet savior. But beneath the surface, the pressure mounts. Jane, like her predecessors, must deliver a son. And then news arrives that changes everything. Jane is pregnant. The palace erupts in cautious joy, especially after tragedy struck earlier that summer. Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged son, albeit illegitimate, died suddenly of illness. With that loss, the stakes of Jane's pregnancy are enormous. Henry, now 45, clings to hope. He fusses over her endlessly, summoning physicians at the slightest cough. A smiling Jane is the only force that seems to calm him now. Even his temper improves. Meals grow quieter, his nights more peaceful. For the first time in months, the court breathes easier. But the kingdom beyond the palace walls is not so tranquil. In the autumn of 1536, while Jane carries the future of the realm, the north erupts in rebellion. Tens of thousands rise in protest, the pilgrimage of grace they call it, demanding the return of the Catholic Church, the restoration of monasteries, and the removal of Henry's so-called wicked advisors. The king's religious revolution is under siege, and Jane, sweet Jane, cannot help but feel sympathy. She dares softly to speak in favor of restoring the monasteries. What Henry says in reply? Well, that's a tale for the next chapter. On October 12, 1537, after 2 grueling days and nights of labor, the agonizing cries from Queen Jane's bedchamber give way to the first shrill wail of new life. A boy, a prince. The news bursts from the Queen's apartments like sunlight through a storm, racing through the palace halls and out across the kingdom. At long last, Henry's heir has arrived. England has a male successor. The reaction is nothing short of euphoric. Church bells toll in wild jubilation from every steeple. Fires are kindled in the streets. Strangers embrace and laugh through tears. In the kitchens and corridors, you find yourself cheering and clasping hands with fellow servants you'd usually avoid. Even the guards at the palace gates weep openly. The realm has a prince. The Tudor line is secure. As for Henry, his joy is uncontainable. He struts through the palace like a man reborn, proclaiming that God has finally smiled upon him. He showers Jane with lavish gifts, calling her my jewel, my true love, as though his heart has finally found rest. For Jane, this is the summit of all her quiet ambition. She has done what 2 queens before her could not, given Henry a living son. And in doing so, she has etched her name into the marble of history. The infant is christened Edward, and soon granted all the princely titles, Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, and more besides. He is the shining centre of court life. Henry watches from afar, as it is considered women's work to care for newborns, but he dotes nonetheless. Grand dreams begin to form around the boy's future, while his 2 half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, are brought to court to greet their new brother. You witness a tender moment as 21-year-old Lady Mary, who once faced her father's scorn, gently cradles Edward, her eyes glistening with emotion. Beside her, Jane beams with pride. Even little Elizabeth, just 4 years old, is permitted to plant a kiss on her baby brother's brow. For a fleeting instant, the Tudor family seems whole, healed even. It is a vision of unity few dared hope for. But behind the joy, an ominous shadow is growing. The labor had been brutal, perhaps more so than anyone will admit aloud. Whispers swirl that Edward had been poorly positioned, and that the midwives were forced to intervene in a gruesome and desperate struggle to save both mother and child. In the days following the birth, Jane is pale but stable. Henry, still drunk, on joy, proclaims her the truest of wives and asks the realm to pray for her swift recovery. Yet as the week wears on, concern begins to spread. You and others stationed near her chambers notice a change in the air, a sickly blend of blood, sweat, and something unnaturally sweet. The scent of death, some murmur. The physicians grow grim. They speak of childbed fever, a fearsome affliction that has stolen countless women after childbirth. Their voices drop when they mention it, as though naming it might hasten its arrival. By October 23rd, Jane is ravaged by fever, delirious and ghost-pale. Henry, for once, does not flee the suffering. He stays at her bedside for hours, holding her hand, whispering desperate words. One of her ladies later confides that she heard the king choke out, "Don't leave me, my darling, for I love you truly." They try everything, milk baths, bleeding, even ground unicorn horn. Likely no more magical than narwhal tusk or powdered. Ibone, nothing helps. Then, in the quiet hours of the morning on October 24th, just 12 days after bringing Edward into the world, Queen Jane Seymour breathes her last. A stillness falls over the court like a dropped curtain. Unlike Anne Boleyn's brutal and controversial end, Jane's death is a blow that stuns the entire palace into mourning. Even those who once scoffed at her meekness now grieve. She was kind, they say. She played the game of queens and paid the ultimate price. Henry is shattered. You see it with your own eyes. The king's face pale and drained, his eyes rimmed red with unspoken grief. Unlike the measured detachment he showed at Catherine's death or the fury that followed Anne's fall, this sorrow is raw, unfiltered. You catch him once in a corridor, shoulders shaking, sobbing like a man whose soul has been carved open. No courtier dares approach him. In that moment, he is no longer the ruler of a kingdom, but a broken husband who finally lost someone he truly loved. Jane is honored with a funeral fit for a queen, the grandest since the passing of Henry's own mother. Draped in cloth of gold, her body lies in solemn splendor as courtiers in black pass by in reverent silence. You are among those who accompany the procession to St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The skies weep with rain as Princess Mary, once exiled, now walks at the head of the mourners. Jane's legacy of healing between father and daughter fulfilled at last. And yet, as the coffin is lowered into the vault, there is one bitter truth that cuts through the ceremony. Jane gave everything to give Henry a son. Her triumph cost her life. The infant prince, too small to understand, sleeps as the kingdom weeps. Henry commissions an elaborate tomb, declaring Jane will be honored forever. Like many of his grand designs, the tomb remains unfinished, but when Henry's own time comes, he will choose to be laid beside her. Of all his wives, it is Jane who rests with the king. In the months that follow, a heavy silence descends on the court. Henry, draped in mourning black, vanishes from public life. He retreats into his chambers at Hampton Court or into solemn solitude with baby Edward. He grows a thick, unkempt beard, the red now streaked with grey. It gives him the look of a lion, past his prime, still fierce but weighed down by age and grief. The balls and banquets cease, the endless parade of dances and intrigues halts, and strangely, you find it peaceful. No new queen, no court rivalries, no bitter guessing about whether this one will succeed where the others failed. Because Jane did it. She gave Henry what he wanted, and now she is gone. You wonder quietly if he will ever love again. But Henry does something no one expects. He waits. For the first time in his reign, he does not lunge toward another marriage. Nearly 2 years pass, 2 whole years without a new queen. In 1538 and most of 1539, the palace enters a strange calm. There are, of course, other dramas. Henry's precarious diplomatic balancing act after his excommunication, rumors of a Catholic crusade, the tragic execution of the elderly Countess of Salisbury, the ongoing ascent of Cromwell. But in matters of the heart, the king is, for once, still, not idle. Behind the scenes, Thomas Cromwell is already at work. Henry, now a widower approaching 50, still commands a kingdom and must secure its future. England, cut off from Rome, faces threats from every Catholic power. What Henry needs now is not just a wife, but an ally. And so, whispers begin. A new marriage is being considered, this time not for passion, but politics. Cromwell's eyes turn toward the Protestant Duchy of Cleves in Germany. Hans Holbein, the court painter, is dispatched across the channel with brushes and canvas in hand. His task, paint the ladies of Cleves. 2 sisters, Anne and Amelia, are under consideration. When Holbein returns, he brings with him a striking portrait. Anne of Cleves, he says, is fair of face and modest of manner, rosy cheeks, gentle eyes. She looks nothing like the stormy seductresses of Henry's past. And that, perhaps, is the point. Cromwell presents her as the ideal Protestant bride, virtuous, politically advantageous, and attractive enough. Henry, perhaps softened by grief, perhaps eager to believe in the painted promise, agrees. Without ever meeting her, he consents. To the match, the marriage treaty is signed, and by December 1539, Anne of Cleves is already on English soil, her ship having braved a cold and treacherous crossing. And so the next chapter begins. You remember watching with quiet anticipation as servants buzzed about preparing the palace for her arrival. No one had seen her in person yet. Would she look like her portrait? Would she please the king? Whispers echoed through the halls. Little did any of us know, this fourth wife, this quiet foreign bride, would change everything. But that, dear friend, is a story for another day. He famously complains to Cromwell, from the very beginning it's an awkward start, palpably so. Henry had imagined a fairy tale meeting, instant chemistry, love at first sight, like the chivalric tales he still fancied. But the real world rarely indulges such fantasies. Anne of Cleves, unfamiliar with the courtly theatrics of England, had no idea that the large, bearded man who suddenly appeared before her was her royal fiancé. Henry had come without ceremony, no crown, no fanfare, expecting to be recognized like a knight from legend. But to Anne, he was just a stranger, perhaps a nobleman, perhaps not, who greeted her with a kiss she hadn't invited. The moment passed, awkwardly, and unfortunately for Anne, first impressions were everything to a man like Henry. From that encounter, something shifted. Henry became quietly convinced that he'd been deceived. Anne, he said in private, was not the beauty her portraits had promised. Worse still, behind closed doors, he was crude and cruel. He told his inner circle that she had an unpleasant odor and suggested without any grace that she wasn't the untouched maiden he'd expected. Some courtiers sniggered quietly behind fans, whispering that the foul smell might just as well have been Henry's own festering leg ulcer. Of course, no one dared say such things aloud, yet the whispers grew, and with them came the ugly nickname, the Flanders mare. Whether or not Henry himself used that phrase is uncertain. Perhaps the slander was born in gossip long after, but it came to define his attitude. In truth, Anne was not unattractive. Her features were soft, her face dignified. But she wasn't the fiery enchantress Henry had once found in Anne Boleyn, nor the sweet, gentle presence of Jane Seymour. Anne of Cleves was altogether different. Reserved, modest, and sensible, she had grown up in the structured formality of the German duchies, where flirtation and courtly games weren't part of a noblewoman's repertoire. She couldn't dance particularly well, didn't play the lute or virginals, and her conversations, filtered through interpreters, were earnest but dry. Henry, now nearing 50 and riddled with insecurities, found none of the sparkle he craved. Anne, for her part, had no way to match his romantic expectations. Still, the wedding proceeded. On January 6, 1540, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, King Henry VIII married Anne of Cleves in a grand but uneasy ceremony. You watched the procession with a sense of tension in the air. Henry wore a stiff smile, the kind one gives when choking down something bitter. Anne, dressed in regal velvet and ermine, held her head high, her expression calm but solemn. By now she must have sensed her husband's disapproval, but she carried herself with dignity. And somewhere in the crowd, Thomas Cromwell stood beaming. This was, after all, his greatest diplomatic coup, an alliance with a powerful Protestant duchy, sealed with a royal marriage. Yet what should have been a triumph soon unraveled into farce. In private, Henry confided to his most trusted advisers that he could not bring himself to consummate the union. He claimed Anne's appearance had repelled him so deeply that he left her as good a maid as I found her. A gentleman might have kept such matters private, but Henry, never one to suffer his own embarrassment in silence, loudly cast blame on Anne. Some at court suspected that the king's waning virility was the true cause. After all, he was no longer the dashing prince of his youth, but regardless of the truth, Henry wouldn't take responsibility. He ceased all attempts to share her bed after just a few uncomfortable nights. Meanwhile, Anne confided to her ladies that she found the king courteous and kind. She never voiced dissatisfaction, but perhaps she too felt relief that their marriage remained, in essence, symbolic. One can only imagine the confusion and quiet despair of being Queen of England in name, yet so thoroughly unwanted by her king. They dined separately, lived separately, and as spring crept into summer, their union existed only on paper. Still, Anne tried. She began learning English, made efforts to befriend Princess Mary, who, to her credit, responded with politeness, and smiled graciously whenever Henry entered the room. But Henry's attentions had already drifted. He had noticed someone new, young Catherine Howard, a fresh-faced teenager at court. Everything Anne was not: flirtatious, playful, giggling, and very, very English. For Cromwell, the man who had engineered this marriage, the tide was turning fast. The king's dissatisfaction was becoming a threat, one Cromwell couldn't contain. Enemies he had long held at bay now sharpened their knives. Chief among them was the Duke of Norfolk, uncle to Catherine Howard. He whispered into the king's ear that Cromwell had oversold Anne's charms, that he had misled the king, that he had brought shame upon the crown. Henry, hurt and humiliated, listened. His wounded pride demanded a scapegoat. Then came the moment none of us thought possible. In June 1540, during a seemingly routine council meeting at Westminster, the doors burst open and soldiers poured in. Cromwell, the mighty statesman who had once controlled the levers of power, was arrested on charges of treason. You could hear the clatter of steel, the bark of orders, Cromwell's voice protesting, indignant and desperate, echoing down the corridor. We, who had owed him so much, quickly stepped away. Better to survive than to defend a falling star. Locked in the Tower, Cromwell penned letter after letter to the king, pleading for mercy, insisting on his loyalty. But Henry no longer read them, or perhaps he simply didn't care. The factions had spoken, and Henry, as ever, followed the path of least resistance. By July, Anne's fate was also sealed. The marriage was formally annulled after just 6 months. It was ruled invalid on the grounds of non-consummation and a long-past betrothal Anne had once had in her youth to Francis of Lorraine. Convenient legal fiction, perhaps, but one that suited everyone. To her immense credit, Anne accepted the annulment with grace and dignity. She reportedly said that she would rather be the king's sister than his wife. Henry, surprisingly generous, in defeat, granted her a rich settlement, palaces, lands, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. No longer Queen, Anne of Cleves, now Princess Anne again, remained in England, where she would live in peace and growing comfort for the rest of her life. In time, you saw her at court on occasion. She had slimmed down, perhaps from stress or perhaps from relief. She dressed with more flair, more ease. No longer the bewildered foreign bride, she had become a respected and well-liked fixture in royal society. Ironically, Anne of Cleves seemed far happier divorced from Henry than she ever was married to him. For most, the story might end there. An annulled marriage, a disgraced minister, a failed political alliance. But for Anne of Cleves, this strange and stormy chapter in her life was only the beginning of something unexpectedly peaceful. Anne, now titled the king's beloved sister, retreats not in shame, but in quiet triumph. Unlike the fates of so many, Women who crossed Henry's path, beheaded, exiled, forgotten. Anne survives. More than that, she thrives. Her dignity throughout the scandal earns her rare respect at a court riddled with whispering courtiers and deadly ambition. She becomes, oddly enough, a success story. A queen who never truly reigned, but outlived almost everyone who did. You see her take up residence at Richmond Palace, then at Hever Castle, once the childhood home of her ill-fated predecessor Anne Boleyn. The irony doesn't escape those who keep track of such things. She now strolls through rose gardens, once tended by a queen executed for capturing the king's heart too well. Anne of Cleves, by contrast, had the fortune of never doing so. In the years that follow, she becomes a familiar face at court festivities. No longer an outsider, she adapts to English fashions, shedding the heavy German gowns for the lighter silks and French hoods of Henry's ladies. She loses some weight, perhaps from stress, or perhaps from the relief of escaping her royal duty. With her head still attached, Anne forms a gentle friendship with Princess Mary, and even young Elizabeth seems to warm to her. She never remarries despite several rumours and speculative matchmakings. Some suspect she was never interested in marrying again, especially after her brief brush with English matrimony. She had seen the beast behind the crown and knew better than to gamble again. When Catherine Howard, Henry's youthful fifth wife, is executed in 1542, the court buzzes with dark humour. Perhaps Anne had the better bargain after all, they whisper. And indeed, by then, Anne is one of the few women still living who had worn a Tudor wedding ring and lived to tell the tale. Even when Henry marries for the sixth and final time Catherine Parr, Anne remains welcome at court. She plays no part in the political dramas of the later years, choosing instead to retire into her own small circle, where laughter is less dangerous and conversation less loaded. Time passes. Henry dies in 1547, bloated and bitter, haunted by ghosts and betrayals. Anne outlives him by a full decade. She sees Edward VI ascend the throne, only to die young. She sees Mary become queen and restore Catholicism with fire and sword. Through it all, Anne remains untouched, neither threat nor prize. Just a quiet woman with a foreign accent and a steady smile. She dies in 1557 at the age of 41 in her private London residence not far from Westminster. Unlike most of Henry's wives, Anne is buried with honour in Westminster Abbey itself, the only one of Henry's queens to be laid to rest there, the only one to die a natural death in her own bed, with her legacy intact. History rarely remembers Anne of Cleves with passion. She was neither a martyr like Catherine of Aragon, nor a seductress like Anne Boleyn, not a tragic child like Catherine Howard, nor a nursemaid like Catherine Parr, but there's something quietly heroic in her tale. In a court where beauty was currency and desire was danger, she lived wisely. She bowed to power, but never broke beneath it. She came as a stranger, was crowned as a queen, dismissed as a mistake, and yet she left as a survivor. She never captured Henry's heart, but somehow she kept her own, and in Tudor England that was perhaps the greatest victory of all.